Well, we've spent the past 2 weeks learning about kinematics, which is a way of describing motion. So now let's start learning about the causes of motion. Now this is part of the field of physics called classical mechanics, and classical mechanics is the study of motion under certain conditions. Classical mechanics works as long as objects are moving much slower than the speed of light, which is usually the case, and it also works when objects are much larger than atoms or subatomic particles. If you want to study the motions of really, really small stuff, atoms, electrons, neutrons, protons, then you need to use quantum mechanics, not classical mechanics. And if you want to study the motions of objects at really high speeds, then you need to use relativity. Those branches of physics came later. When we talk about classical mechanics, we're talking about the discoveries of Isaac Newton, who lived from 1642 to 1726. So Newton was the first scientist to really explain the causes of motion. And he came up with 3 laws that are known as Newton's laws of motion. And we'll be exploring those laws and their consequences over the next 2 weeks. So I want to tell you a little bit about Isaac Newton, because in my opinion, he was the greatest scientist who ever lived. So he was an English scientist. Back then they called it being a natural philosopher. And among his many contributions were the laws of motion that we'll be learning about. Newton figured out a law of universal gravitation. We'll also learn about that in this chapter. He used the laws of motion and his law of gravity to explain the motion of the planets. And he realized that the same laws that govern how objects move in our daily lives on planet Earth are the laws that govern the motions of the heavens, of planets and stars. Newton invented calculus. Newton figured out a theory of color. He separated white light into the rainbow. He developed laws of optics and built the first working reflecting telescope, and did many other contributions to math and physics. Now, what I think is particularly interesting for us to know about in the year 2020 is that many of Newton's major contributions came in one particular year, the year 1666, which is known as Newton's miracle year. And what was going on in 1666 in England was that there was an outbreak of plague. There was a pandemic, and his university, Cambridge University, was closed, so he had to stay at home that year. And while he was staying at home, he invented calculus, figured out the laws of motion, figured out the law of gravity, and developed optics. And he did all this at age 23. So 1666 was a lot like the year 2020.